All right, our text for the day, when we get to it, will be Genesis chapter 32. And we'll also look briefly, well, not briefly, that's a lie. I'll just be honest. We're going to look at Job 1 and 2 as well. And so I begin this sermon series with an easy question to ask. I don't think it's an easy question to answer. And it's this question: why do bad things happen to good people? How many of you guys have ever asked that question before? Why do bad things happen to good people? A couple months ago at one of our prayer meetings, we got done with our prayer time early, and Ellie asked me, Jeff, do you have anything to say? And you guys probably know me well enough to know that I always have something to say. And Shelly would say, well, that doesn't mean you always need to say something. But she asked me to share something. So I grabbed my Bible, I started flipping. And as I was flipping, Randy asked, Jeff, can I ask you a question? If you don't have anything else to say, I said, sure, go ahead. And Randy asked basically that question: why do bad things happen to good people? And I said, Randy, ironically, that is exactly what I was going to talk about tonight. And Randy said, oh, that's cool. And I said, well, it turns out that earlier that day, someone else had asked me that question: why do bad things happen to good people? And it was on my mind that night. And so we kind of talked about it that night at the prayer meeting. And I said, I think we might address this later. This is a question that has plagued Christianity. In fact, you could say, is this a question that has been asked throughout the entire Bible that even predates Christianity? And the answer would be, it does. This is a question that plagues both Christians as well as non-Christians. And it will probably be a question that all humans will face forever and ever. And basically the question is this: if God is a good God, then why in the world do bad things happen? I'm going to add this part, because I think we would all add this part now that I say it. If God is a good God, then why in the world do bad things happen so regularly? I'm going to add that, so regular. Because how many of you guys would say that I've only had one thing in my life happen or how many of you guys would say it seems like it's multiple things over and over and over again? I think the better question is, if God is a good God, then why in the world do bad things happen so regularly to people who do not seem to deserve what they go through? That's a valid question, and maybe something we'll talk about today a little bit. There's two answers that some people might give to this question, and one is this: it seems like God just does not care about me and what I go through, and he seems to ignore me. Or the other option that I often hear people say is this: that God is the one who directly causes these bad things to happen. And so in one case, God just completely ignores us. In the other case, God doesn't ignore us, but he's the one poking us constantly to make our lives miserable. The sermon series that we're going to start today is a sermon series on how to draw closer to the Lord. And if I were to ask you guys a quick survey, what are things that we can do as God's people to draw closer to God? We would probably say, well, read your Bible. You should pray. You should go to church. You should share Jesus with people. You should serve people. And you should give to the Lord. And all of those would be correct. And those are actually things that we're going to cover over the next 6 weeks. But before we got there, there's something that I think in many ways runs through all 6 of those things. And it's something that until we begin to do this, I don't know that we're going to draw closer to the Lord. And that thing is that if we're going to draw closer to God, we must wrestle with God, which, not to get ahead of myself, but it gets at the idea that there are going to be things that happen in our lives that aren't going to have easy answers. And we're going to have to wrestle with God over and over again to do those. And we'll talk about more specifically in the next several weeks, how do we wrestle with God when it comes to sharing our faith? Because how many of you guys would say it's hard for me to share my faith? Do you feel like you wrestle with God when he says, I need you to tell someone about Jesus? And it's like, God, do I have to? Or when God says, I want you to do something that you might not think you're capable of doing, we wrestle with God. And so as I thought about this series, I thought, I don't think it's going to be productive to talk about how to draw closer to God until we just address the elephant in the room, that we are probably going to wrestle with God, because the way that we understand how things should work and the way that things often do work, sometimes those things don't align, do they? and we're often left with questions that we can't easily answer. The one thing I appreciate about the Bible, and I always encourage you, please read the Bible. The Bible it does not shy away from that question. In fact, there's countless places in the Bible where people have the same questions. For example, in Habakkuk chapter, when was the last time anyone read Habakkuk? I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was one of my first sermon series I preached here. So I should have said that, because I could be like, they probably forgot. I could probably preach it again and get like a week or two. Anyway, in Habakkuk chapter 1, Habakkuk is watching the city of Jerusalem being destroyed by the Assyrians, and it's being ransacked. And Habakkuk doesn't understand why God's allowing it. So he cries out to this. This is Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you don't listen? Or cry out to you violence, you don't save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There's strife, conflict abounds. Therefore, your law is paralyzed. Justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted. Those are some bold statements. God, you don't care about justice anymore. Because if you did, I wouldn't be seeing it all. How many of you guys have ever felt that way? It seems like God just turned off, or as Randy said this morning, it's like God puts blinders on and doesn't see what's going on. If you read through the Psalms, there are 65 Psalms where the author is crying out to God, this doesn't make sense. One of my favorite Psalms, Psalm 3, he prays this: God, I'm surrounded by my enemies. Won't you show up and just punch their teeth out of their face? Oh my word. I guess it'd be out of their mouth. If you have teeth in your face, you've got problems. But anyway, the author is full of angst and emotion because he's constantly being pursued, and it doesn't seem like God comes to his rescue. For our text today, I'm going to get jumbled out of my notes a little bit right now. For our text today, let's go to Genesis chapter 32. And we're going to look at the life of Jacob a little bit. We're going to look at the story of Job a little bit, and maybe I don't even know. I don't want to say find answers. Maybe I don't know. What are we doing today, Ellie? I don't know. We'll find out. She doesn't know. She's not seen the sermon. All right. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the story of Jacob, I feel behooved to kind of give you a very quick summary of this man's life. And you might say, Jeff, nothing you do is a quick summary. And I would say, you're right. You're right. So the story of Jacob begins. If you don't know this, Jacob is a twin. They're not identical twins. That does come into play later in the story. But his brother Esau, which is Hebrew for hairy, and you not Harry, Hairy, because he is born to be a very hairy baby. And so Harry comes out first, and as he's coming into the world, his twin brother is holding on to his heel, and it seems like as Esau is doing all the work, it seems like Jacob's just kind of on for the ride. He's like, I'm going to make this as easy as possible. And for some reason, his parents look at this baby holding on to his brother's heel, and they make the conclusion, this is someone who's going to get by in life using other people. What should we call him? Let's call him Jacob. And you might say, oh, that's a nice thing. Jacob actually translates into English as either trickster or deceiver or liar. Oh, what's your name? My name is Liar. Oh, my. Honey, hide the money. And so Jacob lives up to that name. He constantly deceives those around him. He tricks his older brother into giving him all the physical inheritance that dad would give, basically making his older brother, once dad dies, older brother is going to be absolutely broke because of this. And then later in life, when their dad's about to die, he goes in and pretends to be his brother so that his dad will bless him. So he tricks his dad, he tricks his brother, and his brother is so furious that Harry says, I'm going to kill you the moment dad is dead. Jacob finds out, and he's like, I got to get out of here. So he literally goes to the very ends of the known world at the time to live with his uncle Laban for an extended period of time. So interestingly, Laban ends up being more of a con artist than Jacob's a con artist. And so Jacob is exposed, if you will, to his own medicine for about 20 years. And Jacob is Laban's the kind of guy that every time he gets an opportunity to mess with Jacob, he does. And so Jacob wants to marry his youngest daughter. Laban tricks him into marrying his oldest one. And then when they agree on a payment, every time they agree on a payment, Laban switches it around so that Jacob seemingly will end up on the bad side of the deal. 20 years go by. Jacob says it's time to go home now. And so Jacob flees from his uncle in the middle of the night. And on his way home, he finds out that even after 20 years, his brother still wants to kill it. And he's like, oh my, let me backtrack. 20 years later, he finds out his brother's still looking for him. And Jacob makes the natural assumption that he's looking for me because he still wants to peanut butter to the throat. And so Jacob goes to the edge of the Jabbok River, and he makes a very manly decision. He decides, if my brother is going to kill me, I'm going to send all my wives, all my children, all my slaves, all my animals, and all my possessions to the other side of the river, so that if he is murderous, maybe his bloodthirst will be assuaged by the time he kills enough people. And when he gets to me, he'll be too tired to kill me. It's a very manly thing. And I'm just teasing. That's a horrible thing to do. So Jacob sends everybody across the river, and he stays on this side of the Jabbok all by himself, and seemingly in a net of safety with a buffer of people between him and his brother. In the middle of the night, a man shows up, and this is where we're going to pick up in our text. Genesis 32, verse 22. That night, Jacob got up, and maybe if you guys will permit me, I'm not going to call him Jacob. We're just going to go ahead and translate his name better, okay? So we'll call him what he is. That night, Liar got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Liar was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Liar's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it's daybreak." Liar replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Liar," he answered, possibly for the first time in his life actually meaning what he says. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Liar, but the one who fights with God, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Liar said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask me my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Liar called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." In our story, Jacob the liar, if you will, has himself stationed in a net of security with his entire family as a protective force field, if you will. That's a horrible thing. Kids, I would never do that to you unless it was a lion or a bear. I'm just teasing. But as he's in this net of safety, in the middle of the night, this guy just shows up. The guy does not talk to him. He does not say, "Hey, my name's Larry. Nice to meet." They just immediately start fighting to the death. And they fight until the sun comes up. And as the sun's coming up, the man says, "Let me go. It's almost morning." And Jacob says, "Not until you bless me." And the man says, "All right, what's your name?" And he says, "My name is Liar." Maybe, like I said, for the first time, kind of coming to terms with what kind of person he has been, and maybe even continues to be up to that moment. And then the man says something very interesting. Your name will no longer be Jacob, because you're no longer characterized by lying and deceit. Your new name is going to be, in what we would say, is Israel, which means one who fights with God. And it's interesting to me that following that day, every person that is a descendant of Jacob will be called an Israelite, which means the ones who fight with God. That's an odd name, because if we were reading the story and we started Genesis and I said, okay, Adam and Eve sin, and God's goal after Adam and Eve is to find a person whose family after that day is going to be characterized by seeking God's face, and God is going to work in this family and transform this family and ultimately bring the Savior of the world through this family. And we might say, great. So we start reading the story, and the first righteous person we bump into is Seth. And it says that Seth is the first person to call upon the name of the Lord. And we would say, Okay, well, let's call everyone the Sethites then. And they're not called the Sethites, are they? Then we get to Noah, and we're like, okay, well, surely Noah is described as righteous and blameless. Surely he is the one who will have the name for all the people. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Noah roughly means the one who breaks the curse. So maybe we will be the ones who break the curse, and no, they're not called the Noahites, are they? Maybe because that's kind of hard to say. Noahites? Noah? Anyway. Then we get to Abraham, and we're like, oh, surely Abraham is the one that this family is going to be named after, and they'll be the Abrahamites. And the answer is no. Then we get to Isaac, and Isaac only gets 2 chapters in Genesis really to himself. And even then, one of those chapters is in the context of his dad trying to find a wife, and the other one is in the context of his wife having. So Isaac's not really a main character, and I would suggest maybe that's because Isaac seems to already be where God wants him to be as far as character goes. But they're not called the Isaacites. And even when we're bumped into Jacob, they're not called the Jacobites. God says from here on out, the people that come after you will be known as the Israelites, the ones who fight with God. And when we read the New Testament, especially Galatians and Revelation, we find out that the church is the true Israel. And so as God's people, we are also called what? The ones who fight with God. Isn't that odd? That out of all the names to call God's people, we're called by the name, the ones who fight with God. Does anyone find that odd that that would be the name of God's people? I mean, isn't there better? Like Christian means in Greek, it means little Christs. That's nice. That's sweet. But Israel. And just when you think we're out of the Old Testament and we're in New Testament, okay, we're Christians now, we're followers of the way now. That term Israel pops up again. And Paul says, we are the true Israel. We are the ones that God has chosen out of the world to show the world his grace. And it raises this question, why is it that consistently God's people are referred to as the ones who fight with God? I have to tell you another story of another person. Some of you might not be familiar with the story of Job. Is everyone familiar with Job? Is anyone unfamiliar with Job? If even one person raises their hands, I'll tell the story. I raised my own hand, so I will. See, I was going to do it no matter what you said. For those of you unfamiliar with the story of Job, Job starts out with this guy who lives in the middle of this mysterious land named Job. And the Bible tells us that he is perfect. In fact, it's the same Hebrew word that describes God as being perfect, tamim. And so God is in this divine council, and his angels are coming before him, and they're giving a report of what they've been doing and how the world goes. And there's a character who in Hebrew is known as the adversary, or the Hebrew word for the adversary is the ha-satan, which translates in English as the Satan, the opposing one, the one who stands in your way. And as the angels are coming up, this adversary, this Satan, also comes up, and God basically says, what are you doing here? He's like, I'd just like to tell you what I've been doing. And this adversary begins to challenge God's sense of justice. And he says, God, you're not fair in how you deal with people. You have all these people who worship you, but let's just be honest. The only reason that they like you is because you have given them so much stuff. And I promise you, if you were to take away all their stuff, the moment they felt that you betrayed them, they would turn on you in a heartbeat, guaranteed. And God says, have you considered my servant Job? Like Job alone proves that's not true. And Satan says, well, of course he's not going to turn on you. Look how filthy, stinking rich this guy is. And God says, okay, take away everything he has. I guarantee he's still going to follow me. And so the adversary, this Satan character, goes and takes away everything that Job has, which is great. He loses all of his kids in one day. He loses his farm in one day. He loses all of his servants, and his house is destroyed. He basically only has 2 things left, his physical health and his wife, which you'll find out later that the wife's not a great wife. So time goes by, and same thing. The angels come to give a report. The Satan shows up, and he's like, I still don't understand your sense of justice, because you say that this guy loves you. The only reason he loves you is because he's happy and healthy. And yeah, he's upset that his kids are dead, but he would rather his kids be dead than him be dead. So of course, as long as you keep him alive and healthy, he will follow you. If you made him sick for one moment, he would turn like that. And God says, fine, you can do everything you want to him, except for you can't kill him. And so this Satan character goes to Job, makes him sick. If you read the text, there's about 19 different ailments that afflict Job. How many of you guys, you get one ailment and you're done for the year? How many give it? We're all friends here, Ron. How many of you, if you get a paper cut, you're out for the day? Thank you, David. David's the only honest person in this congregation. David, I will also raise my hand. My wife would say, Jeff, if you get a paper cut, you're like a small child. It would probably also be accurate to say, Jeff, even without a paper cut, you're like a small child. That I would say, yes, that's probably true. But anyway, Job has roughly 19 different afflictions, and his story begins. And so after chapter 2, Job begins asking a lot of questions, and most of his questions come down to this: God, why in the world am I going through this when I've done absolutely nothing wrong? I've not sinned. I've not said anything bad about you. I'm a good person, and yet everywhere I turn, my skin hurts so bad. I'm taking broken jars and cutting my skin off so it doesn't hurt as bad, because it's less painful with having those boils off, or whatever they are. It's like, sheesh, this is miserable. And he also has bad breath on top of it. So anyway, Job begins these cycles of just constantly going to God and saying, God, this is not fair that I'm going through this. And what makes it difficult, well, we'll talk about that in a second. I don't want to get ahead of myself. And so as we look at Jacob's story, and as we look at Job, I would suggest this. Since Jacob is the figurehead of those who follow and worship God, Jacob right from the bat says, if we follow God, what are we going to do with God? We are going to wrestle with God. And I could even ask, and maybe I already asked this, I can't even remember, but at the beginning, did I ask how many of you guys have ever asked God, why is this happening to me? Did anyone ever ask that? Why is this happening? It is a question that we're all going to face at some time in our life. And so Jacob gives us this blueprint that everyone who follows God is going to wrestle with God. And then we see the story of Job, and we begin to see what that looks like. Job constantly goes to God. God, this is what's happening, and I don't understand why. Explain it to me. And so what I want to look at today is specifically 4, if not 5, different things from the text. And to see, what does this mean to wrestle with God? The first thing that we're going to look at is, 1, if we wrestled with God, it means that we go to God with our frustrations and our upsetness. I've often heard, not many, but just a handful of people throughout my life that make this kind of statement that we can only go to God when we're in perfect emotions. Like, you have to be happy or joyous to pray. And how many of you guys ever pray and you're not happy and joyous? How many of you guys often pray when you're kind of frustrated about things? I do. I often pray in my head driving to Lancaster, because regardless of what the speed limit is, someone's like, it's not safe to go 35. We all need to go about 20. Jesus, help me. Help me now. My kids are in the back seat watching my witness. Anyway, when we wrestle with God, it means that we go to God with our frustrations and upsetness. Ironically, I would suggest this, that as God's people, we probably go to God more often, more frustratedly than non-Christians do. With non-Christians, if bad things happen, do they go to God in prayer, or do they just they don't care? I don't know why they would go to God. They would just say, God, I don't understand how things work. I'm done. But as God's people, when bad things happen, we go to God and say, hey, this doesn't make sense. Like, I don't understand why this is happening to me. If you claim to be the God of all things, what kind of answer do you have for me? And so part of wrestling with God is we go to God to wrestle with him, and we ask those hard questions. As Habakkuk says, Lord, how long is this going to happen? How long am I going to have to put up with injustice before you come do something? But notice when these people in the Bible have frustrations, where do they go? They go straight to God. And they just kind of, they're just very honest with God. The mistake that we might make with wrestling with God is that we don't wrestle at all. As things happen and we just turn and we go away without saying, God, I'd like you to explain this to me. And what's interesting is, out of all the things that Job said, first off, I would say this. If you've not read Job in a long time, or you've never read Job, you should probably read the book, because Job says some pretty pointed things towards God, and he often accuses God of not being fair in how he deals with people. And what's interesting is, in the book of Job, no matter how frustrated or angry Job gets, does God ever confront him with how hateful he's been? No, he never says, Job, you never should have talked to me this way. In fact, at the end of it, God basically just says, Job, I'm here. Just be comforted by my presence. Is it okay to go to God with our frustrations? And the answer is yes. Is it okay to be angry with God? And the answer is yes. Is it okay to say things out of hurt hearts to God? And the answer is yes. But we have to make sure that we go to the Lord. Allow God to hear your frustrations and just go to him. 2, and this is a tricky one to say, if we're going to wrestle with God, the one thing that we have to keep in mind is that we live in a broken, evil world. And I think sometimes we forget how evil this world can be, that there's a lot of evil people out there. And there's a lot of bad things that just happen because our world's broken. And I think sometimes we forget how broken and evil this world is. And I even think, how many of you guys would say, for the most part, you have a happy, healthy, safe life? I think most of us would say that. But when you read about how the Bible describes humanity, would we expect our lives to be as happy and healthy and safe as they are? And the answer is no. Because think about Adam and Eve's curse all the way back. When Adam and Eve sinned, God says, here's your guys' curses. Adam, I'm going to curse the ground because of you. So the earth itself is now damaged and destroyed by sin because of what you've done. And I know we typically think that means, oh, we're going to have to look out for poison ivy when we go for hikes, and we better be careful when we cut roses, or we might stab our thumbs on the thorns. But I think it's speaking to a larger issue than just the plants are going to get a little nasty sometimes. I think it speaks to the larger issue that the entire earth itself now, instead of being this place of flourishing life, this has now become a place of death because of what you've done. Like, there's going to be natural disasters because of this. There's going to be famines. There's going to be times when just the land that you live in is not suitable for human life. Like, the whole earth is now cursed with death because of what you've done. And then with Eve, I know we typically read that and it says, you're going to have difficulty in childbirth. And most people say, well, that just means when you have a baby, it's going to be painful. But the Hebrew concept is larger than that. And it gets at the idea that as long as you have children, those children are going to break your hearts over and over again. Does that sound interesting, or does that sound horrible? It sounds horrible. And I could even ask, don't raise your hands, but even as adults, how many of you who have adult children, they still make decisions that it breaks your heart when they do it? It's like, why would you? And that's when it says you'll have difficulty in childbirth. That's the idea it's getting at, that your kids are going to do things that throughout their life are going to remind you of how broken people are. And so Adam's has to do with the world that we live on, and Eve's curse has to deal with the people in that world. And so we come away from that thinking, is there any safe place that sin has not affected? And the answer is, sin's insanely thorough. Like, sin is basically the IRS in a way, insanely thorough about everything. And so anyway, because of Adam and Eve, the whole world becomes this broken mess that we live in. And you might say, but it doesn't seem that bad. Like, when I go to Walmart, I'm not scared for my life. Some of you might be, but you'll be okay. Go to the Palmyra Walmart if that's how you feel. But anyway, when we go to Walmart, how many of you guys are scared for your life going to Walmart? The Lord saw that hand. Or, how many of you guys are terrified that you're not going to have enough food for the week? Most of us live happy, healthy, and safe lives. And we might say, if the world's as bad as the Bible depicts it, why don't we experience it? And I would say, well, one, because God is working very actively to keep us from understanding and experiencing the full effects of how evil the world can be. Now, are there times in human history when we see the full scope of how evil humanity can be? The answer is yes. And those are shocking times because God is watching over us so much that we tend to forget how broken this world is. And so when we're reminded how broken it is, it sometimes comes as a shock to us. Maybe when someone passes away, we're like, whoa, and it completely shocks us. But if humanity is full of death and disease, like the Bible says, we shouldn't be as surprised as we are. I took a class on Job in seminary, and Dr. Richter, one of the smartest people I've ever met in my entire life, was telling the story when she was in her Job class. They were talking about this question: why do bad things happen to good people? And the professor answered this way: we shouldn't be surprised when bad things happen to good people. We shouldn't be surprised when marriages dissolve into divorce, and we shouldn't be surprised when babies die. We should be surprised that marriages last at all and that babies can grow to be happy, healthy adults. Like, would you say that's the norm, that most people grow up to be happy and healthy? Yes. But reading the Bible, should that be the case? And the answer is no. But that's because God constantly watches over us and he protects us from most of the brokenness of this world. But every once in a while, will we be reminded of how broken the world is we live in? And the answer is yes. So first, if we wrestle with God, that means that we just go to God and we say, God, I'm so angry about how this is working out in my life. Two, we do have to keep in mind that God did not create a world that's full of violence and death and disease. This is a result of humanity's choices over the years. Thirdly, God doesn't always give us the answers to our questions. How many guys always like to get an answer? I always want an answer to every question. Not always. This is kind of a weird fact. I don't like to know how much stuff costs. Like, that's a weird fact about me. And whenever people are like, your total, I was like, shh, don't say it. It stresses me out. Unless it's under $5, and that's okay. But if it's over, I don't like to know. Other than that, though, I like to have all my questions answered. And when people ask me questions I don't know, I'm going to look that answer up. But I would imagine that most of us like to know how, and again, just to raise hands so I feel better about myself, how many guys like to have all your questions answered? How many guys hate to have your questions unanswered? Or how many guys love to have your questions unanswered? I just love a life of ignorance and bliss. No one does. What's interesting in the book of Job is if you read it in its entirety, and again, I would encourage you to read it. Is there any place in the book of Job where God shows up to Job and says, this is why you've gone through this? He never does. Now you would say, well, what about chapters 1 and 2? And I would say this: we know what happens in chapters 1 and 2, but does God ever explain chapters 1 and 2 to Job? And the answer is he never does. And you might say, well, surely Job's the author. And I would say, well, if you look at the beginning of the text, does it specifically say that Job even wrote this book? And the answer would be, it doesn't. As far as we know from the text, Job never gets a single answer to his question. In fact, when God does show up, God just asked Job a bunch of questions himself. Now, one thing that we could do, and often people do this with Job, is they'll kind of infer some meanings. And so a couple of meanings that I've often heard associate with Job is this: that the reason that we go through hard times is so that we can learn a powerful lesson. Now, that often is true. Like, there's been very difficult things that Shelly and I have gone through as a couple, and we have learned lessons from those things, or at least I hope we have. And Shelly might say, Jeff, you learned no lessons. And I would say that's probably often true. But for those of you going through a difficult time, is that a helpful answer? Oh, the reason that you're going through such a hard time is because there's a lesson for you to learn. Is that helpful in those moments to hear that? Is that kind of an insult at that time? Now, in retrospect, how many guys would agree with that and say, when I went through this 10 years ago, it was hard. 10 years later, I'm glad I went through it because I did learn some things about myself and God. How many guys in retrospect would say, yeah. And even when you read the story of Joseph, Joseph is arrested. He's accused of sexually assaulting a woman. That was a lie. He's jailed. His brothers try to kill him. They throw him in a well. They sell him to someone. His life has a lot of difficulties. And at the end of his life, for those of you who haven't read it, go back and read it. Basically, I want you guys to read the whole Old Testament this week, and we'll be okay for next. But anyway, in the story, all these things happen to Joseph, and he really never makes any judgment about it. He never says, hey, I'm happy this happened. And he never says, man, this stinks. I'm going through this. But at the end of his life, his dad dies, and his brothers show up mysterious. I'm not going to tell you all the plots in case you've not read it, although you probably have. Anyway, his brothers show up, and they're like, right before dad died, he only told us, not you, you didn't hear this, but he told us, we promise, that when he dies, don't put us in slavery or like kill us or anything. Those are dad's words, not ours. We totally definitely did not make this up just so you won't kill us. And Joseph's like, why would I kill you? Everything that you guys intended for evil, God has used for good for the saving of many lives. And I point that out because there's no place in Joseph's life that he says that until it's the end of his story. It's almost like he's looking back and saying, you know what? You guys did some terrible things to me. But looking at the end of my life now, God has used everything for good. And I think that's how those kind of statements are. There are lessons that we learn through suffering. And again, I would say, how many guys have learned powerful lessons through suffering? We all have. Can we say those in the moments of suffering, though? Or is it typically after we get through it, we're like, you know what? Man, that was hard. And I hated that I went through that. But having gone through it, I have learned a couple things. Typically, that's kind of a retrospective thing, isn't it? Not something we typically say at the time. Or we might say this one, we suffer so that we can help someone else down the road. So, for example, no, that's a gruesome example. Don't use that one, Jeffrey. But I want to. You'll get the free donut if you don't. Okay. All right. Anyway, sometimes we might look and say, Job, you went through this difficult time because I know you lost 7 children. There's going to be someone down the road that loses 14 children, and you can help them. That's not very helpful to say at the time either. Oh, you lost your job because next week someone else is, and you could say, we're going to get through. That's typically not helpful. Now, is it true that we can use our pain to help other people down the road? That is very true. But again, not something that we typically want to say as a person is going through that. And what I typically say lovingly, though, is there any place in the book of Job where Job says, you know what? I can use this to help other people down the road. Or here's the moral of my story. You can get through things that you don't think you can get through. Now, can we take those lessons from Job? And the answer is yes. But does the text say that's specifically why he goes through those things? And the answer in that case is no. We infer those, or we might even say we eisegete those from the passage. But it doesn't specifically say, this is why you go through it. And I reiterate that sometimes when we go through difficult times, I might even say this. When we go through difficult times, we often don't get the answers that we want. I know I've gone through very difficult times in my life, and even in retrospect, it's like I have no idea why these things happened. I have no idea how these things happened, and I've learned lessons from them, but that still doesn't help me to understand why exactly I had to go through it. Like, why not, God? Why couldn't you just put those answers into my brain? Like, there's so much that I've learned from college books and seminary books. There's so much I've read over the years on the internet and in other books. God, I'm not a stupid guy. I learn things that I read in books. Why can't I just learn these things from a book and just be done with this? and there's no answer. And I don't know why God doesn't just say, here's a spiritual lesson to take, or here's why you go through this. And sometimes bad things just happen and there's no good answers. Could we explain, and Randy and I were talking about this a little bit earlier, could we explain the origin of evil and why every bad thing happens? We could, but is that helpful? It's often not. Often often in times of loss, people will ask, why did this have to happen? Why did we have to lose this person? And we could go into answers like, well, the reason this loved one is lost is because a long time ago, our ancestors, Adam and Eve, decided to rebel against God and his life-giving power by choosing to eat from something that was not God. And they immediately doomed all of humanity into this ontological presence of sin that we cannot escape without the redeeming blood of Christ. I don't think that would be helpful to say at a funeral. I think the best thing to do would just be to say nothing and just say, I'm sorry. I don't really have a good answer. And maybe, and this is the fourth and final thing we might add is this. In the book of Job, does God ever give Job any answers to his questions? And the answer is not a single one. In fact, as we said, God just asked Job a bunch of questions. But I think it's crucial to note that Job asked all these difficult questions and questions that we can all relate to. And at the end of the story, how does the whole thing climax? It climaxes with God showing up and just being there for Job. And what I can say is this, is I don't have answers for why we go through hard times. And the answers that I do have don't feel satisfactory. They just feel like I read it in a textbook and I'm too insensitive or stupid not to say those answers when you're suffering. But what I do know is that when we go through difficult times, God shows up. That God is there to help us through those times. I can't explain why people lose their jobs who have had those jobs for years and they worked hard. I can't answer those questions. I can't answer questions why do innocent babies die? I can't answer that. Why do old people who have worked hard their whole life, when it comes time to retire, like they get no money back even though they've been given, you know what I mean? I can't answer that question. I can't answer why there are people who make millions and millions of dollars and their employees have to scrap for cash every week and hope to pay one bill. I can't answer those questions, but what I can say is that when we have those hard questions, God's there for us and he wants to help us through those times with his presence. I can promise you at the end of the book of Job, God shows up. And for Job, that seems to be all that Job needs. God, at the end of the day, I just need to know that you care about me. And I think maybe that's what the lesson of Job could possibly be, is at the end of the day, no matter what questions we have or how bad things seem, God needs us to know that he cares about us and he loves us. I'm reminded of a story that I heard in seminary of a couple who had lost their child. And a week or so into the grieving process, there's a knock on the door, and it's someone they knew. And the person says this: I don't know why you've lost your child, but what I can tell you is that God is crying because of this, and he sent me to cry with you on his behalf. That sometimes we just need to know that God's there and that God cares, because it seems like when we go through difficult times, like we said earlier, the two responses I typically hear is either God doesn't care about me and is ignoring me, or two, God is the one that's vindictively messing with my life. We read Job and we see that God shows up and he comforts Job. And what's interesting is with Jesus, God does something that blows my mind. It's as if God himself said, you know what? I don't know that I just want to comfort you through this time. I want to be able to relate to you through this time. And so as Jesus says in John 3:16, that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, and that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. And we see in the Gospels that God gives Jesus his one son. And I would ask this: what has Jesus done wicked wise? He has done Nothing. Jesus is innocent. God is innocent. And yet what happens to Jesus? God's innocent kid, what happens to him? He is peanut butter to the throat. And so when we go to God, we don't go to someone who, like, have you guys ever talked to someone that has no concept of what you're going through? Like, you ever have, like, maybe you're talking to a boss whose wristwatch costs more than you make in a year. And it's like, things are just hard. And it's like, I know you don't understand what I'm going through. You couldn't possibly go through and understand this because you've never experienced what I'm going through. And we might be afraid, or we might even think that that's how God the Father is. God, you've never suffered loss. You have no idea what it's like to struggle. You have no idea what it's like to be tempted. You have no idea what it's like to be rejected by people who love you. You have no idea what it's like to be afraid. And yet when we see the Gospels show up, isn't that exactly why one of the reasons Jesus shows up, just so that God the Father can say, I do know what this is. I know what it's like to be rejected. I know what it's like to love the city of Jerusalem and try to reach them, and they reject you over and over again. I know what it's like to want to be a mother chicken who just wants to gather her babies and comfort them in a storm. I know what it's like to be hated and rejected. I know what it's like to suffer loss. My son was innocent, and he was killed by people who hated him for saying that I love them. I know what it's like to be betrayed. One of my closest friends. We're even eating together. We're literally like, what's that movie with the two doggies and they eat the spaghetti? Lady and the Tramp. It was like Lady and the Tramp. We had one plate and we were sharing it together, and we go into and dip our bread and our hands bump at the same time, and we look at each other and say, you're my best friend. Well, you're my best friend too. Well, guess what that guy did to me a couple hours later? He betrayed me. He sold me out for not even a lot of money. Like, he sold me for 30 pieces of silver, which is nothing. That's like saying, hey, I sold somebody for like $50 today. And it's like, God the Father and Jesus the Son, they understand suffering. And so when we go to God and we say, God, this doesn't make sense. And the reason is because sometimes things don't make sense. I heard one person say this one time, the sane cannot make sense out of that which is insane. That's why it's insane, because it makes no sense. Guess what sin and death and destruction are? They are insane. And there's no good answers. Why do people suffer? Why do people have loss? Why do people this? And there's no good answer. And so the question is, what do we do with it? Because doesn't that make us frustrated knowing that there's no good answer? How many of you guys get frustrated by that? It's horrible. And God says, I want you to come to me with that frustration. I want you to come to me. And remember what Jesus says. And now that I said, let's think about this verse, it's not going to pop in my head. What does he say? Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. And what does Jesus say? In this world you will have trouble, because this world is a broken system that has been constantly ripped apart by sin. For those of you who are tired of the brokenness of this broken system, come to me, and I'll give you the rest that you're looking for. Notice what Jesus doesn't say, and this kind of is frustrating, but that's where we wrestle with it. Jesus doesn't say, come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you every answer you want. He says, I will give you rest. Part of being a Christian is we wrestle with God. I don't think that means we always have to be happy with the answers that we get. In fact, I think sometimes we might just have to say, God, I have to trust you. I don't understand what we're going through. I don't understand why this is happening. And I just have to trust you. And God says, just tell me how frustrated you are. Just share that with me. And typically, and my wife was saying this yesterday, what a brilliant lady. She was just talking about the difficult conversations we have to have as family members. And she said, after difficult conversations where we just kind of wrestle with one another, we get closer to one another, don't we? And it's the same way with God. When we go to God and say, God, this just isn't fair. If you have the power to make things right, why don't you? God, this doesn't make any sense to me. And God says, sometimes things just don't make sense. And if I were to explain it to you, I don't think that would even help out if I did that. But what I can say is I'm here. I want you to come. Just tell me your frustrations. and let's wrestle together. And at the end of the day, I'm here for you, and I get what you're going through, because my son became human so I could experience these things through him that you're going through. How do we conclude this sermon? I don't know, because I don't know that there's I don't know that this is a good sermon, because it's just one of those things. It's one thing to talk about it from the pulpit. It's another thing to go through it. And sometimes going through these things, it's not easy and it's difficult. And if I were to again say, how many of you guys, I could even ask this, how many of you guys are currently going through a situation where it's just like, God, this makes no sense? And I would say that probably, I think they say statistically, 1 out of 4 people is going through something very difficult in their life that they don't think they're going to get through. I said that quote one time to a friend of mine, Shelby, who was a pastor for more years than I had been alive times 2. He's very old. And I said, hey, you know that 1 out of 4 people are going through something difficult. And this is what the pastor said. I think it's 1 out of 1 people are going through something difficult. Every person is going through something difficult in their life. And that kind of put it in perspective that we all struggle in some way. So what I would encourage you to do is, if things aren't quite going how you would like them to go, first off, no, you're not alone. A lot of people feel that way. But 2, don't be afraid to just go to God and say, God, this is what I'm frustrated about. God, just help me to get through this. And know that at the end of the day, God's there to help you through it. So with that, let's close in prayer, and then we'll be dismissed. Heavenly Father, we think of these passages like Psalm 3. We think of Lamentations. We think of Habakkuk 1. We think of Job. We think of our own lives. And God, there's a lot of difficult things that we face. God, we've all faced the death of a loved one. We've all faced maybe an illness that we could not explain. We've all faced maybe not having the job that we want. We've all faced those moments where we just don't have enough money in the account. Maybe someone's been fired. Maybe they've laid people off. God, there's so many things that pop up in our lives that we do not expect. And Lord, we're often blessed by your working in our lives that, God, most of us would say our lives are happy and safe. But God, we are reminded periodically that this is a broken world. That brokenness extends to people. It extends to the very world that we live in. And God, in those moments where we're reminded how broken this world is, it hurts. It feels like our soul has been torn asunder. God, there's really nothing to say. There's no comforting words that are helpful in that moment. And God, everything we think is right is going to sound more wrong than if we hadn't said anything at all. So Lord, my question is, how do we move on? God, there's probably 2 types of people here today. There are probably those who are going through difficult times. And God, all I can say is wrestle with God. Go to God, wrestle with him, and know that he's there for you. And Lord, then there's some people who are not going through a hard time, but Lord, we're always reminded that difficult times are just around the corner. And so God, how do we close? Lord, maybe we just close with asking you to remind us that you care for us and that you're there. God, we're reminded that you're okay with our hard questions. God, we thank you for Habakkuk, who basically says, God, you don't care about people anymore. Because, Lord, if he can be that bold and go to you in prayer with that kind of a statement, Lord, it encourages us that, Lord, we need to come to you no matter how angry we are, no matter how sad we are, no matter how frustrated we are. God, we must bring those emotions to you. And so, Lord, I don't know. I don't know what my friends are going through today. Lord, maybe they're smiling on the outside, but on the inside, it feels like their souls are crumbling and just they're at a loss. God, will you help us to go to you in those times and help us to have faith that you're there? Help us, God, to know that it's more important to know that you care for us than to have the answers that we want. Because, God, that's a hard thing to pray, and that's a hard thing to ask for because we all want answers. God, I pray that you would help us. I pray that you would be with me for the next 6 weeks of this sermon series. Today is the hard one, the one that I struggle with the most personally, the one that I struggle to preach the most, I think, out of the 7. But Lord, help us not to get to where we don't take seriously these hard questions. We love you. We thank you. We praise you, even in difficulty. In Jesus' name, amen. You are dismissed.